Today I want to talk about some of the basic chemistry that you're going to need for biology this year. We're not going to do a lot of chemistry. You're going to take a whole year of chemistry next year, but you do need to understand some basic chemistry before we can understand how biology works. So the first thing we're going to review is the basic structure of an atom. You know, the atom is the basic unit of all matter, and it's composed of three parts. So let's go over the three parts of the atom. Starting in the outside, moving in, you can see these two negatively charged particles out here. Those are called electrons. Electrons have a negative charge, that's why the negative sign is on there, and almost no mass. Diagram A is actually more accurate in terms of electrons exist in clouds. They're not discrete objects. Sometimes we think about planets orbiting the sun or moons orbiting the Earth, but they're really clouds, but they have a negative charge. Then we go to the inside of the atom, the area called the nucleus. We have two structures in there. First off, these positively charged structures are called protons. They have a mass and they have a charge. That's why the plus is on those. So for example, hydrogen has one proton, one electron. Helium has two protons, two electrons. Then the third part is the neutron. Neutrons have mass, but no charge. So they're not going to necessarily balance with the electrons the way protons do. But sometimes neutrons are important because the number of protons has to be consistent. Carbon always has 6 protons. Carbon can have 7 or 8 neutrons. That's when we have carbon-13 or carbon-14, what we call isotopes or radioisotopes. So neutron number can vary. Proton and electron, proton number cannot vary. Electrons can vary, and we'll talk about how that occurs. So let's look at, this is called the periodic table or periodic chart of the elements. Hopefully you've maybe seen this in middle school. So we start off with the smallest atom, which is hydrogen. Hydrogen has one proton, one electron, and no neutrons. And then we go over here to helium. We have 2 protons, 2 electrons, and 2 neutrons. Notice this chart over here. You may have, if you've studied any chemistry, recognize that these helium, neon, and argon are called the noble gases. They're noble because they have full outer shells. They're happy. They're non-reactive, and we'll talk about why that's important. So as we go down, we see lithium has 3 protons, 3 electrons. As we get bigger, we fill up protons, neutrons, and then the electrons outside. But again, I want to just point out that these over here on the far right, the noble gases, are noble or stable because they have full outer shells. They are happy atoms. So when we look at all these hundreds of atoms in the periodic table, there's only about 25 that are required for living things. And of those 25, we can really get down to 4 important ones that make up 96% of living matter. The first important one is carbon. You may have heard we're a carbon-based life form. What does that mean? That means that carbon makes up all these important molecules in our body. So fats and proteins and carbohydrates and DNA. All these important molecules are made of carbon chains. Carbon's about 18.5% of our mass, so it's not the biggest in terms of total mass, but it is important in terms of the variety of molecules it forms. Another important one is oxygen. Now, you tend to think of oxygen as oxygen gas, but remember, we're about 2/3 water, and water is one big oxygen molecule with 2 small hydrogens. So when you add up all that water in your body, oxygen is actually makes up most of our mass in terms of total atomic mass. Hydrogen is also important because it combines with oxygen to make water, H2O, and it also combines with carbon to make all these important organic molecules, like we talked about carbohydrates and proteins and DNA. They're all carbon-based, but the carbon attaches mostly to hydrogen and to other carbons to make all these molecules. The last important atom is nitrogen. Nitrogen is important for 2 important molecules, proteins, which we'll talk about, and DNA, which is of course the genetic blueprint of life. They both have carbon and are made of carbon chains, but they have important nitrogen groups on them as well. So those are the big four. Now there's a couple more that we call trace elements that you need to know about. For example, phosphorus, which is found in DNA, an important molecule called ATP. Sulfur is an important component of proteins. It's what you smell, that rotten egg smell when proteins decay. Calcium, of course, for bones and teeth, found in milk. Calcium is also an important electrolyte. Our nervous system needs it. And then another important electrolyte we need is potassium. You may have heard of, electrolytes and Gatorade, and how when you sweat a lot you lose those important electrolytes. And those folks at the University of Florida discovered that by putting extra electrolytes in a drink, which they called Gatorade, their athletes performed at a higher level. Okay, now let's look at those big four atoms that, again, make up 96% of life. You can see that none of them are inert. None of them have a full outer shell. And that's important because that's going to mean they're going to react to form compounds. So for example, hydrogen has one proton, one electron. Now again, to be in that happy state, it wants 2 electrons in its outer shell. Oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell, 2 in the first and then 6 in the second. It wants 8 in that outer shell to be happy. Nitrogen has 5. It wants 3. So when we talk about the valence is basically how many electrons these atoms want to fill their outer shell. And they're going to do that by combining with other atoms to form molecules. Carbon's important because it needs 4. So it's going to form a lot of bonds with other atoms to fill its outer shell. And we'll look at how that occurs in a second. So again, a compound is when atoms combined to form compounds or molecules. Good example, an easy one, is table salt. Table salt is just a sodium and a chloride. If you take sodium, which the chemical formula for that is Na, combine it with chlorine, which is a deadly gas, Cl, they combine to form sodium chloride, NaCl. Okay, well, how does that happen? Yes, it's a violent explosion. It's very exciting to watch, and it produces this sort of white crystalline substance we know as salt. But at the atomic level, what happens is sodium, notice it's got 1 electron in its outer shell. Now, it doesn't want that. It wants to have a full outer shell. So it's going to want to get rid of that, okay? And when it gets rid of it, it can donate to chlorine. Chlorine has 7 electrons in its outer shell. It would very much like to fill up its outer shell so it can be stable, like those inert gases. So what happens is a sodium will donate an electron to chlorine. Now sodium has a full outer shell. Chlorine has a full outer shell. Because sodium has gotten rid of a negative electron, it now has a positive charge. Because chlorine has accepted a negative electron, it now has a negative charge, more negative particles than positive particles. And what happens to positively and negatively charged substances? Well, they stick together. And when they stick together, that forms what's called an ionic bond. Ionic bonds are bonds due to these charged substances like sodium and chloride that stick together. Okay? We call those charged particles, when an atom gets rid of or accepts extra electrons, ions. Ions are just charged atoms due to this kind of wanting to fill their outer shell. Other strategies are sharing. So sometimes you can think about ionic bonds are when atoms beg, borrow, or steal electrons to fill their outer shell. Sometimes atoms actually will share electrons, so they don't have to just donate or accept, they can share. So if we look at hydrogen, hydrogen has 1 electron in its outer shell. It can share that electron with another hydrogen to fill up its outer shell. So when we talk about hydrogen gas, that's actually 2 hydrogen atoms that are covalently bonded, meaning they share their 1 electron so that they both have 2 electrons in their outer shell. If we look at oxygen, oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell. Well, if it shares 2 with another oxygen, now if we count up the number of electrons in the outer shell, we see that they both have 8. Because they're sharing 2 electrons each, we draw that as a double bond. So the 2 little sticks you see there represent 2 sets of electrons that are shared, whereas hydrogen just has 1 set. And then if we look at carbon, we say carbon's important because it can form up to 4 bonds because it has that valence of 4. It needs 4 electrons. So carbon tends to form large molecules with a lot of bonds on them. So here's an example of a very simple carbon molecule called methane. Methane is basically one carbon sharing electrons with 4 different hydrogen molecules. And this is important because carbon tends to form these big, long chains that are important in biology. And then the last molecule I'm going to talk about is water. Notice that oxygen needs to share 2 electrons, and it can do that with 2 different hydrogens. So the hydrogens have a full shell, the oxygen has a full shell. But you'll notice here there are some charges. The hydrogens are slightly positive, the water is slightly negative. This is what we call a polar covalent bond. So it's a little bit more like an ionic compound in that there is that water is pulling the electrons away from the hydrogens, and that's important. And in our next screencast, I'll talk to you guys about why this property of water, this polarity, is so important in terms of water being the solvent of life.